Welcome to the BankTalk podcast, the show where we talk to leaders and experts from the community banking sector. Whether you are a current CEO or aspire to be one, this podcast will give you valuable insights and advice on how to run your financial institution better. Each episode explores a new topic with a guest who brings their unique experience and knowledge. Tune in and discover something new each time you listen.
Hi, and welcome to Bank Talk. I'm Charlie Kelly, your host and partner at Remedy Consulting. Today, I'm talking with Patrick Centner, who is the Executive Vice President of Colliers and past president of SIOR, which is the Society of Industrial and Office Realtors. For those of you who've been avid listeners of Bank Talk, a couple of years ago, just after COVID, Patrick joined us, and we had a really interesting conversation on where office space was going once everybody decided to work from home or was forced to work from home. So it was a little bit post-COVID that we had that conversation. And I thought what we would do is try to do an update on that today. Just try to find out if, what the health level is of the office space, if there is such a thing, the office space market, if there is such a thing, and just get an understanding of, where real estate is in general. So without further ado, let's get to Patrick. Okay, Pat, thank you for rejoining us on Bank Talk.
Charlie, pleased to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
So when we talked last, now this goes back some time here, it was post-COVID, and I reached out to you because I couldn't find a banker to do this podcast, right? And my theory at the time was that bankers may have customers that have real estate. They have other vested interests. So for me to find somebody who's a banker who's, lending into whether it be industrial or office space might put them in a bad situation with their customers. But anyhow, you did an awesome job when we talked about this prior. And the goal of, I think, of that podcast was to say, all right, everybody left work either by force or because the market changed a year ago or a year and a half ago, I think at the time. COVID had hit, all that stuff was going down. And we were kind of talking about, hey, is the market itself going to redefine that office space? In other words, has Class A become something different? What's being rented? How much vacancies are there? That type of thing. I want to revisit that today. And specifically, I think I would probably start with just a discussion around the space itself. So we did a little bit of pre-prep here, and you defined office space as A, B, and C. Can you walk me through that first? Let's start there. Tell me what A space, B space, and C space means to, either somebody who's doing leasing or somebody who is lending into the space.
Absolutely, Charlie. So there have been historical definitions, and if you go by the historical definitions, it's a lot of based upon the ages of the buildings. Like you could not have a Class A building that was older than 15 or 20 years. The reality of it is that has changed. So when you think of a Class A building, and I don't care if you're talking in a downtown market, in Chicago or Des Moines or whatever, it is a building that is extremely well maintained. You can see, that there's security in the building. You can see the property management. You could see the fitness center. You can see usually a common conference room, meeting area, and you have space that has a look of 2025 and not, 2019 or even worse, 2005. And you just see the buildings being properly maintained with these amenities. That's A. B's are solid buildings, that have solid ownership, might have a coffee shop, might have a fitness center, but you can just tell that the building is a little bit dated, still needs a little bit of a tender love and care, but you could get into that building, probably 10 to 20% less rent-wise than you could in a Class A. Well, then you got Class Cs, and Class Cs were always where our tenants would go if they needed shorter term leases or really just needed the lowest rental rate possible. And they would say, hey, we can go into this building knowing that there are no amenities. knowing that the landlord might not have the greatest reputation, knowing that janitorial might not be daily the way it's supposed to, but we're going to be able to save some money. And that has always been how we've been able to differentiate the three buildings. And it's been that way literally in every market. What's happening now is some buildings which had been Class A are starting to drop down in classification because ownership cannot maintain the buildings at levels that they have in the past. Their debt might be too high. They may have just lost a tenant, whatever the case might be. You're starting to see a transition whereby there are less A's and more B's and C's than what would have been in place prior to COVID.
Ah, that's excellent. That's very interesting. So let me revisit a conversation we had back on our last podcast. We were talking about the potential for, and again, it might have been A's and it might have been B's, but it wasn't C space. It was A's or B's, and we were talking about this potential that if these landlords wanted to update the space, it would be more modular. It would be more, share space type of a space. Basically, try to update the space through modularity, for lack of a better conversation. Did that occur? Because I think the threat there was that even though it would have been nice to do, we weren't sure if they were going to be able to afford it. So let me stop.
It's a great point, Charlie. And the answer is yes, to a point. What we have been able to see here is some of the landlords, maybe they had, let's just say, a 6,000 square foot suite that hadn't been updated in 25 years, and they just wanted to lease that out. They've spent the money and brought it up into what I would call 2025 standards, meaning that it's flexible space. It's very modern, has new lights, lots of natural light, windows, etc. And what has been fascinating is those are the spaces that have leased the quickest. There are probably 4 or 5 buildings I'm thinking about in downtown Pittsburgh who have basically been able to quickly backfill some of these smaller blocks that had been vacant for some time by spending the necessary money up front. As I just said, that was only 4 or 5 buildings, because you're right. Most of the other landlords don't have access to the capital or the appetite to spend $100 a square foot plus on a space.
In the hopes that it'll be rented, in the hopes that it'll rent against all the other space that's out there.
Correct. The funny thing is almost 100% across the board, they have leased quicker than everything else. But it's a roll of the dice. And there are many landlords that either A, don't have the appetite for that roll of the dice, or B, just simply don't have access to the capital to even do it.
Okay. Excellent. All right. So let's go back to the ABC. The question I wanted to ask you, and because I don't know enough about your industry, I have a hard time asking the question specifically, but I always think of health of the office space market, right? And I don't know, in your industry, do you think of, is it vacancy rate? When you say health, or when you say, I could judge how this space is doing, give me whatever information you might have, and you can use Pittsburgh as an example. Just give me an example of how you think of the health of the office space market.
We'll be right back.
Is your technology spend getting a little out of hand? Are you worried about making those big strategic moves because of those hefty vendor contracts? Or maybe you just feel like your technology is currently holding you back. In today's banking world, overspending on technology is a risk you just can't take. Going up against those major vendors on your own can be tough, expensive, and especially when the contracts are designed to benefit them. That's where Remedy can come in. Remedy Consulting helps our clients stay competitive and grow their business with the right technology, products, and their spending strategies. Not a Remedy client yet? Head on over to remedyconsult.net for a free review of your tech stack, spending, and contract terms. Even if you're not the perfect fit, you'll walk away
with expert advice and confidence in your technology decisions. Check us out at remedyconsult.net or give us a call at 262-955-7776. Thanks for tuning in. And now let's get back to the episode.
I'll give you a perfect example here with Pittsburgh. If you go by our statistics, which are very close to similar statistics, with our friendly competitors, CBRE, JLL, Newmark, etc., we're right in the range in downtown Pittsburgh with A, B space at about 22.5% vacant, which realistically is a little bit higher than what vacancy has been over the 30 years that I've been doing this work. However, that doesn't begin to tell the story. The real story is that those numbers are far, far understated. We have seen a nice transition over the past couple years of tenants when their leases are up. They're not going more remote. They are, in fact, going and restructuring their space to have people in it 2, 3, 4, sometimes even 5 days a week. But to do so, they're going into usually slightly smaller space, but brand new customized space. So every group has probably reduced their requirement by 10, 15, sometimes even 20%. So for easy math, 100,000 square foot tenant, moves to a new building and they're in it 80 or 85,000 square feet. So even though that's a brand new lease, great for the market, the reality of it is it still adds an extra 15% or 15,000 square feet into the market statistics.
Patrick, can I stop you there just for a second?
Absolutely.
I think I might have missed part of your stat. So you said 22% vacancy. Is that on A, B, C?
A and B.
Overall?
A and B.
A and B.
A and
Okay,
B.
I'm sorry. Okay,
Yep.
Thank you very much. Okay.
No problem at all. And so what's happening now, though, is we have multiple buildings and some of our largest buildings in town where the anchor tenants have less than 5 years of term remaining on leases that were signed 7, 8, 9, 10, and in some cases 20 plus years ago. And as you would expect, those tenants are just in the process of figuring out what their new requirements are going to be. So just thinking of 3 tenants in our market right now who will have leases coming up in the next 5 years, you're probably looking at least an additional 1 million square feet of space that is going to be coming back onto our market within the next 3 to 5 years. And we know that, and there's really no way around that. So ultimately, that 22% is artificially low. If we really wanted to break it down, we would make estimations on the requirements, potential requirements for these 3, 4, 5 anchor tenants in downtown Pittsburgh, and then figure out really where the vacancy is. So what's happening here is, so if you do that, you're probably looking at a vacancy rate of somewhere in the mid 30s here in downtown Pittsburgh. But the Class A buildings, the buildings where landlords are in a position to spend significant money, not only on the base building itself, but also on customizing the tenant-specific space, they are seeing vacancy rates significantly less. There are a couple buildings right now where there are literally multiple proposals on full floors, whereby there are also other buildings that haven't had tours of any sort in 3 or 4 months. And we are seeing a scenario whereby more so than at any time this century, there are haves and have-nots. And a lot of it really comes down to the landlord, their access to capital, and their willingness to put it into a building to bring it up to Class A levels and to truly compete for the prime tenants in our marketplace.
Interesting. Okay, so if there's a big step off between A and B, A being very highly rented, B, A modular or A flex space or whatever being very highly, and then obviously it's going to drop as you get to B. What happens in C?
Well, C is they're always going to be there. If you know, hey, I need to get space for $10 a square foot, and I don't care if there's vagrancy outside my building. I just know I need to have a presence downtown and want to spend as little money as possible. It is so weird to say this, but if I had to rank the viability of space in most downtown markets, current A's are killing it. The C's are about at their historical levels. The B's are getting slaughtered.
Ah, interesting. Interesting. Yeah, I guess it does make sense. If they can't rent to one, they might be able to rent to another, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay, that's super.
And then you might look at it this way from a rental rate standpoint. I'm just using just general numbers. If a Class A building historically has gotten $30 a square foot, and a Class B building has gotten $20 a square foot, and a Class C building has gotten $12 a square foot, the A's are seeing that $30 rate, if not higher. The C's are seeing that $12 rate staying there. The B's, on the other hand, they'll do $20 deals, but with no tenant improvement allowance or with no parking or whatever the case might be. So the only way they can compete is to try to then offer that space, at $15 or $16 a square foot. And for the most parts, they're not getting any nibbles on it.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Oh, that's great. All right, so let's spend a couple of minutes on what happens to the loans, right? I always think that if you're going to lend on, whether it be industrial space or office space, as a banker, you're going to have a 5-year balloon. For those not familiar with the term, what that means is you might amortize your loan over 30 years, but when 5 years comes up, you have the ability to say, as a banker, I'm not interested in taking this loan out with you. And so, you get the opportunity to re-underwrite it, get a feel for that space. If the 22% increases because of what you said, that dynamic around either folks shortening their space or just abandoning their space and moving to C, how does that match, in your opinion, with the timing around these balloon loans? In other words, if one of them is a 10-year lease and the 10 years is not up, right, and then you have a 5-year loan, those two, aren't necessarily running in parallel.
Correct.
Right. So, at some point, I would think that a lot of these buildings become real estate owned by the banks, or some of them might. So just give me your thoughts and opinions on that, if you would.
So the one thing that we've seen so far is it's rare for the bank to actually take over the property. They don't want to do so. And I'll give a real quick anecdote here, though. There is a building here in Pittsburgh that the bank did, in fact, take over. And they made a strategic decision that they were going to focus on renewing the two biggest tenants in the building. And, again, no landlord involved, but the tenants and their representatives, in essence, negotiated directly with the lender. The lender was able to secure these two tenants under long-term leases. And now, you might look at the building and say, oh, wow, the building is, 66% vacant. However, the lender realizes, wait, no, the 33% that I have leased is covering our note and will cover our note for the next 7 years. So that is one where I'll give the bank credit. And I was part of the negotiating with one. I've never had a negotiation where we were dealing directly with the lender, where my commission agreement was directly with the lender, where the tenant improvement allowance was being paid from the lender directly to the tenant. So that was one example. But virtually every other building, lenders do not want. We had another building, a newer building in Pittsburgh, gorgeous building, where the tenant or the landlord was missing out on some key tenants because they had floors that had never been built out before, which was going to require, at least $130 a square foot to build out. So they had no activity for a year and a half because they couldn't get these deals done. But the lender then decided, hey, we are probably better off here getting the space built out. So they in turn made additional loans to do the tenant improvements. And lo and behold, the building has gone from basically 25% leased to 75% leased. And I like their rationale because ultimately, if they had to take the building back, 1, 2, 3, 5 years from now, they'll at least have a very attractive building that does not need much additional capital. So those two scenarios are very, very unique. The other buildings, in most cases, the landlords are literally trying to hand their keys back to the banks. And the banks are like, no, let's just, kick the can a little bit longer. It has just been such a fascinating situation to watch.
Yeah, that really is fascinating. And again, what do you get if you're the banker? Either way the loan's upside down, but now you're the tenant. Or right, you're the landlord, and that is
we're starting to see some sales now, and they're really telling. We had one of our nicer suburban buildings just sell at $11.08 a square foot, whereby historically that probably should have been a $90 to $120 a square foot building.
Really?
And no one wanted it. And the fact that it sold at that number was shocking to those of us who have been doing this forever. We currently have 3 sales that are supposed to be under contract right now, in and around the CBD of Pittsburgh. And, as weird as it sounds, we're waiting anxiously to see who is going to buy these buildings and at what price, because these are some decent assets. And if they come in at solid numbers, then I'll feel a little bit better about the market than I currently do. But if they come in where I expect them to, they're going to come in at numbers that were, in many cases, a quarter or a third of what their original acquisitions were. And it is going to reset everything. So with some of these buildings, if a landlord has access to capital and they get these buildings cheap enough, they may be able to take some of these Class B properties and make them A, simply based upon buying it at the right number. So we're really waiting to see how these 3 assets trade.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, so then one other thought I had there is, at some point, do they get does somebody buy one of these things and try to make them into a set of apartment buildings or something else that's more leasable? Is any of that going on? Any redevelopment of the any of these? Again, maybe these are the C-class buildings. I don't know. But
The short answer is yes. And in fact, one of the 3 buildings that I was just describing is what I would call a solid Class B office space. And what I'm being told, and we don't know this for a fact, but I'm being told by the folks who are listing it, that there are 2 offers to convert it into multifamily. And then there are 2 offers that are in place to maintain and then enhance the office leasing in the building. So not only are we kind of sitting back trying to see what the property is going to trade at, but then ultimately what is it going to be used for?
interesting. Okay, that's fascinating. I mean, because eventually something's got to happen, right? You're either going to knock the building down and
Correct.
get the amount of vacancies back where they need to be, or redevelop it, I suppose.
100%.
Excellent. Okay, let's spend a little bit more time around the lending into these buildings, right? And again, I would imagine there's always a scenario where each one might be different, right? But we spent a little bit of time around whether or not this becomes real estate owned at some point, and I think you said very clearly banks don't want them. How are these other folks that are buying them? Anybody who might be buying into this space where they know that this pretty dynamic area, how are they getting loans?
So
Is it securing it with some other form of capital, or how's that?
in some cases, yes. In many cases, they're going to be putting more of their own money into it. the loans that are out there are being underwritten much more closely, but it ultimately, for example, you're seeing more personal guarantees than you probably did pre-COVID. And, if you have a solid developer who's been around forever, that they have, the personal wherewithal, and that if they buy, $100 a square foot building for $20 a square foot, they then easily can put in the necessary money to build out the space. So in some cases, what these acquisitions are is the individuals are buying them either with cash or with 80% down mortgages versus the traditional 10 or 20% down. But they're then looking at it from the upside and saying, okay, great, this building, I'm buying it, and the average rent being paid is $18 a square foot. If I can put in, $50 a square foot of base building improvements and get it up to the upper 20s, does this acquisition make sense? And if it does, then at that point in time, financing is absolutely more available. But it's not just, based upon the building's value, because the building's values are all so unique right now.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, and I suppose everything is something different, right? Depending upon where it is and all those variables. Excellent. Okay, Patrick, the last question I think I want to ask is, let's take this from the perspective of somebody who owns a company and still needs some space, right? Maybe not 100% of what they needed 7 or 8 years ago, but what does that look like? Are they willing to move space? Give me a feel for how you help them shop if they're willing to pick up and move to a different building.
Absolutely, Charlie. In fact, that's what I do on a daily basis. And past couple years, we've worked with tenants ranging from 1,000 square feet up to north of 125,000 square feet who were in buildings that, for whatever reason, whether it's a safety reason, maybe the area is not as, nice as it used to be from a lack of amenities or whatever, or just simply they have space that hasn't been updated in 15 or 20 years. They look at it and say, all right, what are our true needs? So we work with them to figure out what their needs are. And again, in some cases, so likely a reduction in square footage, but a new structure. You don't have the big giant offices anymore. Instead, you have, smaller offices that people can utilize, when they come into, the facilities. So once we have that information, then we have to literally look at every building individually within the geographic parameters that our client has given us to determine, number one, is the space available that they need? And the answer for most of those questions is yes. But the bigger question, and the one that we never really had to ask before, is can this particular landlord invest enough money into the space to make it an attractive relocation option for our client? And historically, landlords have been the ones trying to get a good understanding of the tenant's financials in order to underwrite the lease. That's still done. However, we are now, as tenants, underwriting the landlords and making sure that it's not a situation where the landlord makes this great proposal and is then not able to proceed forward with things because they didn't have the financing behind them. They didn't have the capital behind them. We actually know of a situation where a tenant moved into a building with the understanding that the landlord was going to redo the bathrooms, provide a certain level of build out. The tenant gets close to the end of their lease, getting ready to move, and then the landlord says, we don't have the money to do so. So instead of blowing up the lease, the landlord just said, I'll give you a year's worth of free rent if you then build out everything for yourself. Most tenants aren't in a position to do that. This particular tenant did go forward, but I'm glad I wasn't representing them, because that would have been a huge mistake on the part of anybody giving them advice, because they should not have ever even considered that particular asset.
Right. Okay. So here's one other slight question off of that is, Could the same thing happen? Forget the build out, right? Could the same thing happen with maintenance of the property? So,
Oh,
give an example,
absolutely.
right? 10,000 square feet, you decided to rent 2,000 of it. And then all of a sudden it turns out that 6,000 of it's unrented and the guy can't afford his loan or maintenance or what have you. Is that the same sort of backwards underwriting of the landlord? I think that
Absolutely. And in fact, what's happening is we are negotiating clauses into leases that we've never negotiated before. Earlier in this podcast, I discussed a building that we ended up negotiating directly with the lender. Well, in doing so, the lender agreed to maintain certain parts of the building at such and such level. The lender agreed to upgrade the parking lot area. The lender agreed to do a tenant fitness center. So all of these things are in the lease. And if those things don't occur, it's a default, and then the tenant controls and can leave whenever they want. Again, things that were not being done prior to COVID.
excellent. Hmm. Okay. Wow. Wow. It certainly sounds like the market's changing and continues to change, and it still needs to shake itself out a little bit.
No doubt, sir. No doubt.
Excellent. Well, Patrick, thank you. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today.
Absolutely, Charlie. I enjoyed it and always here if folks have questions.
Yeah, it's been great, man. Very educational. So that's all for Bank Talk. Appreciate everybody listening in today. Have a good day and keep on learning.
Thank you for joining us on the Bank Talk podcast, brought to you by Remedy Consulting. If you'd like to connect with Patrick, please refer to the episode description for contact details. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please rate, review, and share our work with others. To stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to follow the show and turn on notifications. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.